Hey friends, it's me, Mr. Risner. Now, some of you may recognize me from my viral video hit Anatomical Motions, but today I'm here to talk to you about the first part of what we're going to learn with tissues. We're going to talk about today what tissues are, and specifically epithelial tissues. Now, when we're talking about tissues, we don't mean these types of tissues. We're talking about the types of tissues that your body is made of. So buckle up, it's going to be one wild ride. Now, when we talk about tissues, what we're really talking about is a group of cells that are similar in terms of how they look and what they have in them, and they work together to perform a specific function. Now we're going to learn about the four categories one at a time. Epithelial, which we'll cover today, connective in the next video, and then we'll lump muscular and nervous tissue together because we're going to cover those in much more detail when we get to those units specifically. Now for today's focus, epithelial tissue. These are the general functions or where it's located. And so epithelial tissue, it covers body surfaces and organs. It also could form the inner lining of body cavities and hollow organs. It composes things called glands, which we'll focus on at the end of this. And its function is to protect, to secrete things, or to absorb things. These are some common features of epithelial tissue. The cells are tightly packed, unlike other tissue types. This type of tissue, the cells also can readily divide or make copies of themselves. That's really important because being exposed to the environment or to fluids or open spaces means that these cells can be easily damaged, or they can be sloughed off on purpose. Sloughed off means that they release themselves on purpose, or like your outer layer of skin just sheds. And so those cells need to be able to replace themselves. Typically, it will lack blood vessels. Now, that's a generalization because blood vessels are made of partly epithelial tissue. But if the epithelial tissue is not part of a blood vessel, it will lack blood vessels. The nutrients, though, can diffuse through them. There's always an exposed surface called an apical surface, and that is going to be exposed to a fluid or to air. Opposite the apical surface, it's anchored by a basement membrane to whatever is underneath it, typically connective tissue, though sometimes muscle tissue. Here's a diagram. So you have an open space, whether it's an air or a fluid, and then this layer only is your epithelial tissue. There's a basement membrane, sometimes not visible, sometimes it is a little bit thicker. And then underneath here, I've put the underlying connective tissue. This is not part of the epithelial tissue, only this layer is the epithelial tissue. Now, there are many types of epithelial tissue. It's classified by how many layers of cells there are, or the cell's shape. If it's a single layer of cells, then that's called simple epithelium. If it is multiple layers of cells, that's called stratified epithelium. The cells might be flat, in which case they're called squamous, and they look like this, mostly flat, maybe a little bulge for the nucleus. They might be cube-shaped, in which they're called cuboidal. Or they might be long, in which case they're called columnar. And they typically have either cilia or microvilli on columnar epithelium. So these are the specific combinations of those. You can have simple, meaning single layer, squamous, this shape. So these are a single layer of flat cells, very thin, and it allows diffusion through them. And so like the airways, the alveoli, the small air sacs in the lungs, and capillaries, the smallest blood vessels to allow things to diffuse back and forth, are made of this simple squamous epithelium. Because though they are so thin, they are very easily damaged. Simple cuboidal epithelium, again, simple meaning a single layer of cube-shaped cells. These specialize in secretion, and some examples would be in the kidney tubules, where they help produce urine, and the lining of the ovaries. Simple columnar, a single layer of column-shaped cells. They can have cilia, as in the female reproductive tract, where they would help those cilia. Remember that cilia are like fingers that move things along, and they help move an egg cell or a fertilized egg cell through the female reproductive tract. Or if they don't have cilia, they might have microvilli in the digestive tract. Microvilli are smaller than cilia. They don't move really on their own, but they help to increase the surface area so that those cells can absorb nutrients out of the food. Then there's pseudostratified. Pseudo means fake. So this is a fake stratified columnar. They're called pseudostratified. They look like it might be multiple layers, but actually each of these cells does reach the basement membrane. Some of them don't reach the apical surface, but the nuclei, because they're at different levels, make it look like it's multiple layers when it's really just one. You'll find this type of epithelium in the airways, and what it does is it produces mucus that would sit on top here, exposed to the air. The mucus would trap microbes, dust, or other things from getting into the lungs, and then the cilia on the surface would wave it away from the lungs, eventually up to the voice box and to the throat, where you would swallow the mucus. Stratified squamous means that it's multiple layers of those flat cells. And this is the thickest epithelial tissue, even though these are flat cells, because there can be so many of them. They specialize in protection from microbes or chemicals, but also because it's so thick and it's waterproof, would prevent loss of water and other substances. The outer layer of skin is stratified squamous epithelium. The name of the cell type in the stratified epithelium is always based on just what the outer surface cells look like. And so the bottom cells in stratified squamous epithelium might look cube-shaped, but as they get closer to the surface, as they move closer to the surface, as they grow, they become flattened. Stratified cuboidal epithelium is only 2 or 3 layers of cube-shaped cells, and they surround a lumen or an opening. These can be found in the mammary glands and sweat glands. Stratified columnar, again, it's only the top layer of cells that are columnar. They would look cuboidal underneath. They would line larger ducts that need a little bit thicker protection, and they also line the male urethra. Transitional epithelium can be really thick or really thin. It specializes in expansion or stretching, and so this type of epithelium lines the urinary bladder to let it expand, and the ureters, the tubes that connect the kidneys to the bladder. And now finally, glandular epithelium. Now glandular epithelium isn't its own thing, but these were some of the specific types mentioned before. But these are really just going into detail about how they produce and secrete substances. There are endocrine glands which release their substances into the blood or body fluids, and those things are called hormones. We're not going to go into as much detail on those because there's a whole unit to be done on endocrine system. Exocrine glands are glands that release their substances into the digestive tract or to the surface of the skin. Exo means out of, endo means into. Now there are a few ways that it can do that. Merocrine glands release substances through exocytosis. They just release the substances very easily, and those would be things like your salivary glands. Apocrine glands release small parts of the cells. Small pieces of the cells break off and disintegrate into that substance that will be secreted. These are things like the mammary glands. And finally, holocrine. They release a whole cell that eventually will disintegrate and form that substance that is excreted. And those are things like the glands that produce sebum, and that is the type of substance that keeps your hairs moist. It's the oil that keeps your hairs moist. Well, thanks for watching. Hopefully that was all clear enough. And in class, we're going to be looking at some microscope slides of these different types of epithelial tissue to help you understand these drawings that we made. You're going to be taking photographs or drawing them and labeling these different parts: the open space, the epithelial tissue, the basement membrane, the underlying connective tissue, and identifying the specific type of epithelial tissue and what its function is.